Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Washington State, Ms. Jayapal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Clearly, there is an agenda here, and it is about impeaching Secretary Mayorkas. I want to take a step back and just say that it is quite stunning to have some of the witnesses here today that have the audacity to come before this subcommittee and attack the current Homeland Security Secretary. Mr. Wolf, who was Chief of Staff to Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, was a key architect of the universally panned by majorities of Americans across the political spectrum, that very cruel and unlawful family separation that was perpetuated by the Trump administration. Further, according to a federal judge and the Government Accountability Office, Mr. Wolf served unlawfully as the acting Homeland Security Secretary. Mr. Edlow, as acting Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, helped to run that agency into the ground, to the point that it almost had to furlough over 13,000 USCIS employees. On his watch, USCIS also ignored the Supreme Court's decision in June of 2020, stating that the Trump administration's attempt to rescind DACA was unlawful, holding new DACA applications at processing facilities even after the Supreme Court mandate was formally entered. And these are the witnesses that the majority brings to this subcommittee to discuss if, quote, the laws are being faithfully executed. Forgive my skepticism, or more bluntly, give me a break. Mr. Reichlin-Melnick, let me turn to you. I want to discuss mandatory detention. As discussed in your testimony, Section 235B1B of the Immigration and Nationality Act states that if an officer determines an individual has credible fear of persecution, that person, quote, shall be detained for further consideration of the application for asylum. That makes it sound like asylum seekers must be detained. Can you explain why all asylum seekers are in fact not detained?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think the main reason is resource-based. But there's both resource and legal authorities, I should note. But the biggest issue here is resources. For example, if 50,000 asylum seekers show up at the border in any given month, and every one of them asks for protection, there are not 50,000 detention beds. Even in 2019, when detention was at its highest, there were 55,000 detention beds, and that year, 891,000 people were encountered by the Border Patrol. And if even half of those were seeking asylum, it would not have been physically possible to detain all of them, which is why, under the Trump administration, hundreds of thousands of asylum seekers were released straight to court without going through the credible fear process. So this is, at the end of the day, it is a resource issue, and I will also note it is a legal issue because there are always exceptions to mandatory detention because Congress, generally speaking, can't force the executive to enforce the law in certain circumstances where that is literally impossible.
Has any administration, Democratic, Republican, ever been able to detain every single individual as required by the section of the Immigration and Nationality Act?
No, and in fact, when Congress first passed that provision in 1996, there were actually fewer than 10,000 detention beds. And this is at a time when there were routinely 1.6 to 1.7 million Border Patrol apprehensions a year. So it was not possible when Congress passed the law. It's not been possible any time over the last 27 years, and it's still not possible today.
And it's correct, isn't it, that even at our highest levels of detention under the Trump administration, it was never close?
That's right. In 2019, the Trump administration maxed out detention beds about 55,000 in August 2019. That month, there were more than 55,000 people who arrived. And we also have to note that the average time that a person spent in detention was over a month. So the average detention bed in ICE detention only turned over about 10.7 times a year. So there was a max capacity that they could hold, even at 55,000 beds, of less than 500,000, and that year about 900,000 people showed up. So that's why the Trump administration, in fact, released hundreds of thousands of people.
So that's a lot of numbers. Let me just ask you bluntly, many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle like to claim the Trump administration ended what they call catch and release and detained all asylum seekers or sent them back to Mexico. Let me just ask you again, is that accurate? And just a simple yes or no answer is fine. And if not, you've already given us some of the reasons, but is that accurate?
It's not accurate, and even in 2020, after Title 42 went into effect, several thousand people were released, according to data from DHS.
From your testimony, it appears there is a detailed chart which shows that the Trump administration released over 500,000 migrants at the border during his 4 years as president. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's directly from the border, and additional were held in ICE detention and then released.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I have to go fast because I think there's just so much that Secretary Mayorkas is responsible for and culpable for. So I'll start with you, Mr. Bradbury. At the direction of Secretary Mayorkas, DHS has released and continues to release tens of thousands of aliens every month into the U.S. through mass parole and now categorical parole. Is this a violation of law?
Yes, it violates INA Section 212 D5A.
Secretary Mayorkas is also mass paroling aliens he himself characterizes as refugees or asylum seekers without demonstrating that there are compelling reasons requiring that that particular alien may be admitted by parole rather than going through the USRAP process for refugee admissions. Is that a violation of law?
Yes.
What law?
It's a violation of INA Section 212 D5B.
Because he's not conducting adequate individualized vetting of the huge volume of mass-released aliens, there's simply no way of knowing how many of the millions of aliens Mayorkas has released into the U.S. fall into these categories of dangerous aliens. Is that a violation of law?
Yes, of Section 212A.
Secretary Mayorkas has instituted, as you've talked about, and all of you have mentioned, is the CBP-1 pre-registration, trying to funnel these illegal migrants to the U.S. ports of entry along our southern border. Is that a violation of law?
Yes, of 212, of 235, and I would say of 207.
All right. So what's happened here, of course, is that just in this past week, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit halted 2 DHS efforts to release massive numbers of illegal migrants into the U.S. on parole. So this is what one of the judges said, in this opinion right here, that what his violations of the law, Secretary Mayorkas' violations of the law, are, quote, akin to posting a flashing "come in, we're open" sign on the southern border. The unprecedented surge of aliens that are started arriving at the southwest border almost immediately after President Biden took office, that has continued unabated over the past 2 years, was a predictable consequence of these actions. Indeed, former Border Patrol Chief Raul Ortiz credibly testified based on his experience that there have been increases in migration when there are no consequences, and migrant populations believe they will be released into the country, close quote. And I won't go into the additional case as well, but I'm going to ask Mr. Wolf this question. We've established that Secretary Mayorkas is engaged in conduct violates his oath of office and the law. My question for you is, do you believe Secretary Mayorkas is violating the law intentionally, willfully, or is it just some oversight on his part?
So I'm going to have to guess. I think it's all of the above. I think they know exactly what they're doing, they being the department. This construct that they have put in place is not by happenstance or by chance, it's by design. And I think it's been very clear over the last 2 years. So everything that's going on at the border and the crisis that we see unfolding there was completely predictable. And we had talked about to the incoming administration about some of the challenges that we had in the Trump administration and warned them that if they did half of what was campaigned on during 2020, that they would see a crisis at the border. And so presumably they knew that, presumably they heard that,
so
yet it still went forward.
The Secretary and the new administration heard that? Incoming Secretary, right?
Numerous briefings, again, mainly with transition staff.
Okay, Mr. Edlow, I wanted to ask you this question, and it's related to testimony we heard yesterday about what's going on the border and the impact on Border Patrol agents and morale, et cetera. What are you hearing about what's going on because of the arrangements of this secretary?
Yeah, sir, I've heard that morale is at an all-time low throughout Border Patrol and throughout other enforcement entities. You know, I've spoken to some people who have been at the border recently. They've seen that exact same thing, that people are just very unhappy. They don't know whether they should be doing the job or whether they are supposed to be ignoring the law. And a lot of it's being run by memos that are, or just oral guidance being passed on.
I want to ask you the same question that I asked, and this is with regard to Secretary Mayorkas. And that is, do you believe that what he's doing is intentional, willful, or is it just he's just an incompetent buffoon and can't learn his lessons?
I don't think he's incompetent, Congressman. Looking at the memos, looking at the departmental actions, the regulatory actions, this is all part and parcel of an intentional action.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think it's long past time for him to be impeached. Now, I yield back.